Charles Lister, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute and Director of Syria Program. Thanks for joining me on American Dialogues.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So first, Charles, can you give us an overview of the situation in Syria now?
Gosh, the situation in Syria is not good. And that's to put it simply. Pretty much every aspect of the Syrian crisis that we've been watching play out since 2011 is worse today than it has been almost at any point over the last 13 plus years. The major sort of alarm bell for Syria is the humanitarian crisis. So even at the height of the most intense periods of armed conflict in maybe 2014 and 2015, even compared to that, the humanitarian crisis today is worse than it's ever been. More than 90% of Syrians live under the poverty line. Roughly the same number of Syrians are entirely dependent on international aid. And yet, at the same time, despite aid needs being higher than they've ever been, the international community's aid mission in Syria is only 26% funded. So, and that fund managed by the United Nations is designed to meet the minimum needs in Syria, and yet it's only a quarter funded. So you can only imagine all of the spillover effects of that in terms of instability, terrorism, extremism, crime, and of course just human suffering is all worsening at a month by month rate. More broadly, Syria is, of course, nearly in its 14th year of the crisis. There's no resolution to the crisis. So significant efforts were made by much of the region, much of the Arab region, just over a year ago to try to engage Damascus and perhaps push it or encourage it towards some form of diplomatic process. Frankly speaking, none of that has gone anywhere. The regime was unwilling to give concessions in return and engage in some form of a negotiation. Beyond that, of course, since October the 7th, Syria has been drawn in a number of ways, which perhaps we can come to talk about. But Syria has sort of represented its own dynamic with regards to the wider regional hostilities and tensions that have dominated the region since Hamas's attack on Israel on October the 7th last year. So Israel has significantly escalated its actions in Syria, conducting dozens and dozens of strikes. Just last week, it conducted strikes in Palmyra, the central ancient city, killing more than 60 people, all of them Iranian proxy militiamen. So that's another dynamic. Then there's the Turks and the Kurds in the northeast. That is a hostile dynamic that is escalating. The regime has significantly escalated its attacks on northwestern Syria, home to more than 3 million displaced people. ISIS is very clearly recovering. ISIS right now is on track to double its operational tempo across Syria compared to 2023 and triple its operational tempo in the northeast, home to US troops and the Syrian Democratic Forces. So really, no matter where you look, everything is getting sadly much, much worse with no real resolution on the table.
Yes, I want to cover with you the ISIS, part, but before that, what were the major policy differences between President Biden and President Trump first term on Syria?
That's a very good question. I mean, to be honest with you, I think there in many ways there were very minimal differences because and in large part because neither administration placed Syria very high up on the priority list. So under the first Trump administration, Syria was very clearly not a priority, with the exception of finishing the fight against ISIS's territorial state or caliphate, whatever we want to whatever we want to call it. The vast majority of that counter-ISIS campaign took place under the Obama administration, but it was finished or completed under Trump. So with the exception of the counter-ISIS mission, Syria diplomacy, the Syrian crisis writ large just wasn't much of a priority. The only areas where it was when Iran policy became part of the equation. And clearly the Trump administration, with maximum pressure against Iran, saw Syria through that lens. But of course, that was entirely irrelevant to the idea of the wider Syrian crisis. When Biden came into office, it was an open secret that he told his senior Middle East leadership team, keep Syria off my desk. And in many ways, the order was to keep the Middle East off President Biden's desk. This was not a presidency that wanted to see the Middle East high on the priority list. It wanted to focus on great power competition with China. It wanted to focus on the incoming war, as it was known then, with Russia set to invade Ukraine. And so issues like Syria really were not something that the Biden administration wanted to get sucked into. Obviously, since October the 7th, some of that has changed. It has obviously forced the Biden administration to engage more deeply in Middle East crises. I think we can very rightly question how effective that engagement has been. But big picture, actually, when it comes to thinking that Syria was a priority and deciding or not to deal with it seriously, both Trump and Biden were more or less the same.
So both wanted to just keep the status quo in Syria?
I think both understood that the status quo, taking the ISIS issue off their desk, because that's a separate issue, but with Syria writ large, the idea was that the situation in Syria was containable, and it wasn't a direct threat to US interests, particularly to the US homeland. So the humanitarian crisis, these are not my words, but what has essentially I've heard from both is that the humanitarian crisis in Syria is terrible, but it's not a direct challenge to US national security interests. The Syrian regime's foray into global drug smuggling is a significant issue, but not one that it poses a threat to the United States. We understand that our regional allies and partners face very significant economic challenges from having to play host to millions of Syrian refugees. But again, that's not something that challenges US national security interests. So generally speaking, the only issue that was a priority was counterterrorism. And the counter-ISIS mission was something that both administrations decided to continue, but not fundamentally transform or adapt to changing conditions, just continue. And so, yes, status quo, as you call it, was exactly the right phrase to describe both administrations' approach to Syria from a broader lens.
So how do you expect the US approach to Syria to evolve in a Trump second term?
I mean, this is the sort of trillion-dollar question these days, at least for those of us who work on many issues across the Middle East, is what will the incoming Trump administration do? To be honest, it's somewhat confusing in the sense that Donald Trump is appointing a very wide spectrum of individuals into senior positions. Some of them are clearly on the kind of isolationist camp. These are individuals. Tulsi Gabbard, for example, is a very big name who's been appointed to a senior position. I think a number of individuals who are yet to be publicly appointed, but who are heading towards the intelligence community direction, like Tulsi Gabbard, are also on the isolationist camp. And these are individuals who basically believe that the US has no business being engaged in crises in the Middle East. It's not our business. It's not our problem. America shouldn't be spending its money on sending its personnel abroad to try to deal with these issues. They should be somebody else's problem.
Do you agree with that?
Say that again?
Is that right? Do you agree with that?
I don't. I mean, there's a balance. Of course, America can't be the world's policeman, and that's, a very blunt term, but the United States can't be expected to have to help or intervene all around the world simultaneously. No country should or could. Of course, the United States doesn't also have a fantastic track record of effectively intervening and helping in crises around the world. Of course, the war in Iraq was a disaster. Afghanistan was not a success. I would personally argue, as someone who's worked on Syria for 15 years, that when it comes to our counter-ISIS intervention, it's actually an amazing record of success at very minimal expense. And in fact, I have an article out on this last week, laying out the numbers. But that's a sort of separate argument. But we have this kind of isolationist camp. But then we also have the more kind of traditional, conservative, almost neoconservative approach, which stands by the idea that the United States should be intervening very directly against Iran in the Middle East, and that they see Syria as a part of that equation. And that these same individuals also, of course, made a lot of noise about how disastrous Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan was, and they will not want to be associated with anything similar in the case of Syria, for example, of withdrawing troops that then leads to more chaos and instability. So there's a real division. And I don't think anyone, honestly, anyone knows yet how this kind of balancing act between these two camps is going to come out.
And can you please name the people on neoconservative? Like, I probably rob you one of them, but I really want our listeners to know.
Yeah, of course. So, like Marco Rubio, for example, in line to be Secretary of State, Michael Waltz in line to be National Security Advisor. I mean, those would be the two big names who have definitely taken much more strident, much more assertive tone when it comes to the US policy, but also what they see as US responsibilities in the Middle East. But like I say, there's going to be this tussle between what we call political appointees, people who have been appointed into positions by the president. The other angle here, which I think perhaps hasn't had enough attention, is also that in Congress, yes, the Republicans have won a majority in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Mm-hmm. And in theory, that means that the Republican Party will have a very easy path towards pushing legislation. But one of the sort of dynamics we've seen develop over the last few years in Congress is that both on the sort of liberal left side of the Democrat Party, but also on the fairly right-wing side of the Republican Party, both sides have this much more isolationist tendency. And I wouldn't necessarily say they have a majority yet, but they have a lot more clout, this isolationist tendency, a lot more clout in Congress than there is in the White House or in an administration. And so I think to some extent, if the Trump administration wants to take a much more strident position on Iran, on Syria, or other issues like that in the Middle East, it could be that they actually face a challenge in pushing that through in Congress. So it's not just a matter of numbers and the Republicans having more numbers, but you have to dig deeper than that and look at the actual agendas and the vision of those members and of those congressmen and women.
Who's going to be the key person for Syria in Trump administration?
Honestly, no one knows yet in terms of Syria. I think a lot of it will depend on whether or not the president wants to bring back a Syria special envoy, which we've had in the past. Ambassador Jim Jeffrey played that role for some time. Joel Rayburn played that role for some time. I've heard plenty from at least one of those names that yes, definitely there will be a Syria special envoy and Syria will be a high priority. We haven't seen any real evidence for that yet. I think time will tell in the next few months. If there is a special envoy appointed, then I think we could assume that Syria policy will be given at least some leeway to be something meaningful under the next Trump administration. If there isn't a special envoy, then I think that probably sends the message that it's not going to be a priority. And if Syria is an issue, it will be folded into a bigger regional agenda.
So how Western governments, including the US, can show that they're interested in resolving the Syrian crisis?
Well, I mean, as it happens, I'm actually running a quiet but fairly significant international sort of track 1.5 process on this and have been for the last 9 to 12 months now, which is engaging with more than 100 Syria subject matter experts. It's engaging with the US government, the UN, the Europeans, and all of the regional governments, trying to find areas of shared interest and more realistic approaches to Syria policy, both in terms of just simply improving the conditions on the ground in the immediate term, which is urgently needed, and then creating conditions that pave a path towards a more effective political process. And there are like 1,000 good ideas out there that can be done. The problem is, frankly speaking, is convincing the US and the Europeans that this needs to be a priority foreign policy issue. And with the war in Ukraine ongoing, the Europeans have very significant and what they perceive to be more immediate challenges. And in the US, we are just in this kind of isolationist period of time where the US just doesn't feel the need to be involved. And so that's just still a struggle I'm trying to push forward. But the key point here is there are plenty of good ideas. And there are areas of shared interest between the Middle East and between Europe and between the United States where we really could make progress.
Mhm.
But I think an incoming new administration in Washington is always an opportunity to push those good ideas and to encourage the right kind of decisions. But the US and Europe and the Middle East are going to have to meet in the middle on some of these issues. And what the region wants isn't always going to be exactly what the Europeans want, and what the Americans want isn't always going to be what the vice versa. There's going to have to be a consultative process between those governments before anything Syria focused gets going.
So when you say these ideas, do they include or rule out a regime change in Syria?
I mean, the days of regime change are long gone. It's just
Okay.
impractical. I mean, unless something happens inside Syria that pushes things in that direction, that's not something that I think almost anyone in the international community argues in favor of anymore. I think that, the realistic language that actually emerged under the first Trump administration, which was behavioral change, is, I think, the kind of unified consensus that realistically speaking, Bashar al-Assad may not be going away. But Bashar al-Assad, as of today, remains a very serious problem. It remains a problem primarily for Syrians. And incidentally, the rate of Syrians fleeing Syria, so not refugees who are already outside of the country, but Syrians fleeing Syria from regime-held areas to Europe has gone up by 350% in the last 12 months. So Syrians living under the regime today are fleeing because regime control as it currently exists is not enough to convince them to stay in their own country. So Bashar and his regime, his security apparatus, the way that they're a predatory state on their own people, that has to change. Now, that doesn't have to mean that Bashar leaves, but it does have to mean very serious reforms and a change in the way that that regime treats its own population.
Quickly, under Trump, first, what is the nature of the U.S. military presence in Syria? And under Trump, how will he change something regarding that?
Mm-hmm. So the US has roughly 900 troops in northeastern Syria. So, all things considered, a pretty small presence. But then also, all things considered, those 900 troops are the only reason why the Syrian Democratic Forces, our longtime partners in the fight against ISIS, are able to control 25% of Syrian territory. The second those troops leave, the SDF suddenly will become not an irrelevant actor, but a very weak actor. So 900 troops are having a very significant impact in terms of the on-the-ground dynamics. They're present in the northeast, stretching from parts of Raqqa and Hasakeh in the northeast down south towards Deir ez-Zor and the Iraqi border. And they are there officially on paper by US law to continue the fight against ISIS. They are also there, not necessarily legally on paper, to also monitor Iran and the movement of Iranian proxies across the country, the shipment of weapons from Iran through Iraq over towards Lebanon. And they're also there, frankly speaking, also to try to have, on paper, a diplomatic effect, to provide leverage to the US and its international partners if and whenever there was some form of a political process.
Even with that, ISIS is still recovering significantly, as you just said. What are the reasons?
So, I mean, there are a number of reasons for ISIS's recovery. Two really are the most significant. The first and most significant is that ISIS made a decision back in late 2016. So this was 2.5 years before it lost its last territory in eastern Syria. It's, at this point in late 2016, it still controlled Mosul, it still controlled Raqqa, but it made a decision to begin what it called a retreat to the desert. In other words, ISIS was aware that it was going to lose all of its territory at some point, and that it needed to take steps to allow the movement to survive at some point in the future. That retreat to the desert was primarily a retreat to the Syrian desert in central Syria. And so it was a pragmatic and strategic decision. We shouldn't forget that ISIS's roots go back all the way to the late 1980s. This is a group that has had historically, before it became a global movement, a presence in Afghanistan, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Syria. ISIS has existed for far longer without any territory under its control than it has with territory under its control. So it's very well versed. It has that kind of historical context, and it has learnt lessons. So anyway, it made that decision in 2016 to retreat to the desert, and it had spent that time since building kind of a support infrastructure in Syria's central Badia desert. And the desert also happens to be an area that the regime has been more or less either unwilling or incapable of governing or controlling from a security perspective. It is a huge expanse of territory, very minimally populated. And apart from some gas facilities around Palmyra and Al Sukna in the center of the country, there's very little out there for the regime to be securing and to constantly have a presence, especially not when it's already engaged in a nationwide civil conflict. So ISIS took advantage of that ungoverned space. Fast forward more towards today, following the territorial defeat of ISIS in early 2019. Now, the second reason is also important because it pulls in the regional dynamics, and it shows that Syria and the situation in Syria doesn't exist in a vacuum. The second reason is from the period immediately after the October the 7th attack last year, up until February 2024, Iranian proxies launched over 150 attacks on US troops in Iraq and in Syria. And a majority of those attacks were in Syria. And it forced US troops to hunker down in their bases, and they were not given permission by the US military to leave their bases. So it essentially froze the counter-ISIS mission for 4 or 5 months, just at that period of time when ISIS had, I think, coincidentally made the decision to seek to expand their recovery into northeastern Syria. But they suddenly found this, sort of almost welcoming environment because the US military wasn't able to operate. And that really, I think I would describe that as putting ISIS's recovery on steroids. It really surged the recovery because they didn't face resistance. They couldn't. Now, finally, we are where we are now, where ISIS has significantly resurged. The US has significantly intensified its counter-ISIS operations in the last couple months, including for the first time carrying out very heavy airstrikes in the regime-held central desert. And as has been described to me, those US strikes have hit huge ISIS training camps that have sat in that desert for years and never been touched by the regime. They just were ignored. And so the US military took things into its own hands and hit those bases in September and October this year.
Yes.
That hasn't turned ISIS's momentum down yet. It will take time. But there is, sorry for the long answer, a lot to explain in terms of why we are where we are.
One name that came up during our conversation is Tulsi Gabbard. I know you pray she wouldn't, handle anything related to it, right?
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, she's a very controversial figure. She's a conspiracy theorist. She's celebrated in Russia as a hero in America, and there are very few Russian heroes in the United States these days. But, listen, her history on Syria is, in my view, it's appalling. I mean, at the height of armed conflict, she paid 2 visits to Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, in which she then returned to the United States and refused to call Assad an adversary. She refused to call out any of his crimes. She questioned whether or not the chemical weapons attacks that hit Syrian civilians were real. She has privately, I'm told, suggested crazy, wild conspiracy theories that perhaps some of those chemical weapons attacks were inspired by Western intelligence agencies in order to somehow put Assad into some kind of a regime change conflict. And she has visited child victims of regime bombings and questioned them in their hospital beds as to whether or not they really were hit by the regime, or perhaps they were victims of some, jihadist opposition, in her words. So her record on Syria is appalling. And I think, to anyone who knows Syria, I think we're very disturbed at the fact that she could be holding such a sensitive intelligence position. And just to finish the thought on that, it is a very sensitive intelligence position. She would be coordinating the entire breadth of the US intelligence community. There's 18 intelligence agencies in the United States, and she would coordinate the collection, dissemination, and analysis of all of their intelligence efforts on behalf of the president as director of national intelligence. And I've already heard from several European partners that they are extremely concerned that Tulsi Gabbard could be in that position, not so much because of Syria, but more because of Ukraine. But, you know, if we're in a place now where it's all well and good for politicians around the world to say, you know, oh my God, we're going to have to deal with Donald Trump, or, oh, you know, I don't like Marco Rubio, or this person or that person. But this isn't that. The concern I'm hearing from very senior government officials, and including from the intelligence community abroad, isn't just concern. This is panic. This is, well, we may be in a position where we won't be able to share all our intelligence with the United States if we know that this woman is in that position. And that's really quite alarming. That's much more than just not liking a particular personality.
So Gabbard is a former Democrat. She ran for president. I just want to hear from you why someone on now is appointed to be director of national intelligence. Why do you think she's misled, as you think?
Honestly, I mean, it's a kind of complicated story, but let me give you an anecdote. So Tulsi Gabbard was on the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee for the Middle East, which is part of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, responsible for overseeing, from the House side, US foreign policy in the Middle East. And that gave her a position in public hearings to question serving administration officials, and then folks like me on the outside who would be called in to testify to the committees. While she was a congresswoman, she was, as I say, a member of that committee. And I testified twice to that committee on Syria policy years ago while she was still in office. And I assumed at the time, given how vocal she had been about Syria, you know, she really made an effort to make noise about Syria policy in the media. I assumed she would attend the session and then ask questions and probe and demonstrate some level of knowledge. So on both occasions, she was barely present. She missed the presentations by the administration officials. And when it came to questions, she left before she had an opportunity to ask questions. And to be honest with you, I take away that as an anecdote as really telling, because if someone really cared about an issue, in this case, Syria, and they had a position of such responsibility, they would make the time to sit through that session. They would make the time to listen to the administration. They would make the time to ask appropriate questions, either learn more or push the administration to consider other ideas. She did none of that. So I took away from that Syria wasn't anything she really cared about at all, but she had found a wagon, she had found an issue to ride upon that would create noise, give her the right kind of attention that she was looking for. And of course, she came into Congress at a time when we were just starting to see these kind of isolationist tendencies on the left and the right, this idea that America shouldn't be involved in the world. But at that time, at that early time, the few people who were holding those positions, whether in government or in the media space, they were crazy conspiracy theorists, to put it bluntly. You know, they weren't the more sensible establishment figures who just simply believed that America shouldn't be doing stuff. They were a little on the wild, weird end of the spectrum. And I think she found an opportunity to push some of those wild and weird ideas to make a lot of noise. And she created a real persona around her. Everyone knew who Tulsi Gabbard was. She wasn't a senator. She wasn't someone of real significance. She was a congresswoman from Hawaii, which on paper doesn't give you a great deal of significance in the American political system. But she made a lot of noise, and it created a brand that ultimately led her to run for president as a Democrat. And then over time, this kind of isolationist tendency became sort of more mainstream, and it also embraced more sensible people. And also, to kind of complete the circle, saw the left meet the right in some areas of policymaking. And in that sense, her very strong isolationist trend and her dabbling in conspiracy theories found herself a very natural home under part of the Trump movement. And I think, she was never going to win out as a Democrat because she was very unpopular and people saw her for what she was. But she had much more of a chance to make it on the right. First of all, obviously, Syrians are living an amazingly different reality today than they have done for more than 50 years. So to an extent, there continues to be, weeks after Assad's fall, sense of elation, euphoria, and that is definitely encouraging a sense of unity across the country that perhaps wasn't there during the 13-year crisis that preceded Assad's fall. At the same time, the nature of the transition underway in Damascus, the fact that it's led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which obviously raises lots of sort of controversial questions and dilemmas, adds to the challenge going forward. HTS has, I think, done a lot that perhaps wouldn't have been expected to try to send the right signals of unity, of representing minority communities, of establishing security across the country. But there are real challenges. Hundreds, if not thousands, of regime loyalists who remain committed to the regime's cause remain on the ground in hiding, carrying out acts of violence, and that is destabilizing the situation in the country. Dozens of Syrians are dying every week now in unexploded munitions. So there's a long-standing kind of security after effect from the past 13 years. And then, of course, Syria's economy is totally broken. So what we're seeing is a really big push by regional states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and others, to try to prop up the Syrian economy and prevent a complete collapse. And being the fact that we're in winter, there is a real prospect of that if it wasn't for this regional support. So I would basically say, big picture, a lot of the international community is doing what it can, given the constraints, given the challenges, given the complications and dilemmas, to try to both prop up this transition, but also direct it in the right directions. And Syrians are, of course, hopeful that all of this will take all of the right steps and result in the formation eventually of a new government. There'll be some kind of a national conference, and Syria will start rebuilding. But the challenges are enormous. So all of the early signs are good, but there are a huge number of challenges and hurdles to get over if this transition, which will take a long time, is going to work and is going to reunify the country.
Charles Lister, Director of Syria Program in the Middle East Institute. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.